Welcome back. This session's all about writing your presentation, or in fact having your presentation written for you. We want to ensure that whether you write the presentation yourself or whether you are having it written for you, that the information is in a logical sequence, that it's straightforward to write. You don't struggle over getting the words right in the presentation because you don't know where to start or where to finish. So let's have a look at a bit of an overview of writing your presentation. Basically what you're going to do is write it down and then say it. Once you know who in general you're going to speak to, you have to know what you're going to speak about. It's important for you when you're preparing and writing your presentation to find a method that works for you. Now I'm going to give you an example of a method that I've used over the years and I find most useful, but I've come from an era where we had to type our presentations, where we didn't have the advantages of the electronic age. We couldn't record and have voice transcription of our recordings into speeches. So for some students of mine, that's a very useful method for them. They actually record what their thoughts are, they record their voices on their phone and then hand it over to someone who massages that into a logical sequence for them, and then they'll review that and think about how they're going to present it. So that's one way of doing it. But for me, I'm very much in favour of the physical cut and paste method. Now I use a couple of different methods, but the one that has worked particularly well for me over years and years and years is the cut and paste method. Each sentence or point should be written out and cut from the page so that you have a piece of paper with each sentence or point individually on it. Then it's simply a matter of moving them around physically until you settle on an order that sounds right if you run the talk through your head. Alternatively, you can use something called the sandwich method. Now this is where you write down all of the points or ideas that you want to cover, and that becomes the filling of the sandwich without thinking about the start or the finish of your presentation, which equates to the bread either side of the filling. So you put down everything that you want to say, or all the points you think you need to cover, remembering that we've got to keep an eye on the time that we've got for a presentation. And you don't worry about the beginning or the end. Then you write down the ending. Once you've done all of the middle bit, the filling, you write the ending, you emphasise the call to action or what you want your audience to know or to do after your presentation is finalised. And then you write the beginning of the presentation. Now I'm going to talk a little bit later about some good ways that you can start a presentation. In the next session I'm going to talk to you about creating a great first impression. And there again I will talk about what you can do at the start of your presentation to make sure that you have some impact and you've got the audience listening to you. But for the moment we're still writing the presentation, so let's focus on that. Regardless of the method that you use, when you do have someone prepare the presentation for you, and I know that many of you have your speeches written or your presentations written for you, I believe that you should always write the opening of the presentation yourself, so you can give it your personal style input, so you can have some way of feeling at one with the presentation and preparing yourself before you actually have to look at the words that you're going to say to this group of people that you're talking to. I thought it might be interesting to have a look at how you can structure your speech if you're taking it from a report or from a book or some other format that is already written out in a particular way. So let's say that we are looking at translating, for want of a better word, your speech from, or your presentation from a written document. So the title of the report, the author's name, the position and the background becomes the introduction to the speaker. So the speaker is introduced with the title or the subject matter of the speech or the presentation and some background information where appropriate. Now in the next session, where I look at creating a great first impression, I'm going to talk to you about how you have an introduction that is appropriate for whatever kind of presentation you're going to give, but more of that in the next session. So something else you might have is a table of contents. And what does that become in your speech? This is where you tell the audience what you're going to talk about. It's giving them a roadmap to follow during your presentation. Charts and tables. This is where we might fall into the trap of using too much PowerPoint or Keynote. But what other ways can you present charts and tables? You can do it with a whiteboard. You can do it with butcher's paper where you actually draw it and do a live demonstration of what this looks like. I will caution you here about using pie charts. There's a great little graphic that goes around the internet every so often that it depicts a pie chart, and actually when you look at it, it is the sky and the sun shining on one side of the pyramid and the shadow on the other side of the pyramid. And every time I see a pie chart, I think of that particular graphic. So be careful about the images that you use, or the charts and the tables that you use. Make sure that they cannot be misinterpreted. Underlined words, words in boldface or exclamation marks. How do you emphasise these things when they're written down rather than when you're giving a presentation? So you might write the words on a whiteboard or on butcher's paper, just a single word, linger over them or repeat the words, and use appropriate hand gestures for emphasis of those particular words. And so when you're writing your speech, beside the word you would put something that says, write this down on the whiteboard, or repeat this, or some other indication of a hand gesture that you might want to use for emphasis at that particular point. And those sorts of notes I think it's important to have within your written speech, so that when you refer back to them as you're going through your speech, you remember that that's what you wanted to do. Photographs. Here you paint the picture for them. You tell them a story or an anecdote that builds up a word picture for those that are listening, so that they can get a visual sense of what you're talking about. Paragraphs. Very easy. You pause for a few seconds between each separate section or idea in your presentation, and we're going to talk a lot about pauses as we go through this particular training. If you've got a list of items in alphabetical, numerical or bulleted order, the best way to present that in a speech or a presentation is to count off the items in order to help the audience stay on track, to follow the progress of what you're talking about. Again, it comes back to this roadmap of letting the audience know where you are and where you're going. Chapter headings. Say something like, now I'm going to talk about X. So you introduce the idea of this is another part of the presentation separate to the last lot that you've talked about. Quotation marks. Here you can say something like, as so-and-so once said, or you use the words quote unquote, but don't make the air signs with your fingers as though you're making quotation marks in the air. It's very distracting for people. Page numbers. Let the audience know where you are in the speech or the presentation. Revisit the roadmap. Go back and remind them of what you said you were going to tell them and how far you are into the presentation itself. Names or other identification can be quite confusing for people if they've got to listen to a presentation and it's something that you're not repeating too often, because when you read something and you don't understand a name, or you don't understand where this particular name or identification fits into the whole of the thing that you're reading about, you can go back a page or so and get your place again. So in terms of a speech and writing your speech, you refer to people, places and things by the same name each time, so that it's clear to what or to whom you are referring. And this is where you do not use acronyms, you don't shorten it, you don't use jargon, you don't use your nicknames, all of those things that confuse people when they're trying to follow who you're talking about, where you're talking about, or what you're talking about. And you refer back. So X works in the same way as Y, which I talked about earlier. Now, conclusions. Summarise, and possibly you could start with in conclusion, but that's a bit of a formal ending. But also the conclusion can be telegraphed by the tone of your voice. Make your final sentence strong, a call to action or a visionary statement. The last thing you say should be the strongest thing you say, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. What you need to do is find a method that works for you, whether it's the method that I suggest through this training or whether it's something that you've developed over the years, or whether it's something that you've seen someone else do, we do have a wealth of technology available to us these days that is far more useful in preparing presentations than anything that we've had in the past. Now, I come from an area where we type our presentations when I first started out. And these days I'll use a combination of the method that's always worked for me, and sometimes when I haven't got a lot of time to get the preparation ready, I'll do a voice recording on the phone and then hand it over to someone to massage into a typed format for me, so then I can transfer it into the system that I've used over the years that's been so successful for me. In talking about technology, I will caution you about using PowerPoint and Keynote as the basis of your presentations. Nobody wants to sit through what is now called death by PowerPoint. Not so much death by Keynote, but certainly death by PowerPoint. It is not an engaging presentation. People will lose interest. It's not the way that a lot of people learn. You need to be thinking about how people learn, how people hear information, how people take in information, and adjust your presentation accordingly. So PowerPoint is something that I won't be promoting, and Keynote I won't be promoting in this series of information sessions. What you do need to do is find a method that works for you in preparing a presentation, and then you need to look at the practice side of things. Now, we talked a bit about that briefly in the previous session, but what you've got to do is actually say your presentation out loud once you've got it in the sequence, in the way you're going to present it, so that you ensure that you can get through it, that you learn about your breathing, you learn about how you enunciate words, all of those things that go into a review. And in a later stage, we will talk about how you review your presentation, but at this point, what you need to ensure is that you've got your words in a logical sequence, that you can actually say them and breathe at the same time. Now, I know that I said in all of those methods that you should run the talk through your head, but it's not enough to run the talk through your head. The physical requirement of talking out loud will determine where you need to breathe, and this in turn affects how you can physically get the words out. Now, often we'll write something down on paper, we'll say it in our heads, and it's all fine. And when we actually go to enunciate the words, they just don't come out. For some reason, the neurological pathways are not working the way they should, and you can't get the words out. So you must, after you've got the presentation in its logical sequence, you must say it out loud so that you know these things, like where you breathe, where you want to put some emphasis, all those sorts of things, which we will cover a little bit later. Now, you can just read it, or you can record it, and there's lots of apps that you can put on your phones these days that will give you a nice, neat, easy to use recording. I have a very good one that doesn't take up much space, and I find it really useful just to run through a talk and then listen to it, and then I can readjust some of the things I need to say or get the order a bit more logical. So it's a very good revision exercise for you to be doing. The first time that you either read it out loud or you record it, you need to know where you automatically pause, where you emphasize a point, and where you might need more explanation or information. Make those sorts of adjustments, swap around the sentences if you need to, try it again out loud, and keep doing that process until you're comfortable with the flow of the talk. And it's not just the words, it's not just the content, it's about where you're pausing, it's about where you're emphasizing, and you need to be making notes of those in the written version of your presentation to remind you as you're practicing of where you felt it was important to do those sorts of things. Just before we finish up this session, I want to talk about pauses. Pauses you will hear me refer to often in all of these sessions, because I find that pauses are probably the most important thing that you can incorporate into your speech for a whole lot of reasons and in a whole lot of ways. So a pause is where you actually stop, where you don't say anything at all. It's not where you just take a quick breath. It's actually stop, don't say anything, look around the audience, control your breathing, think about the next thing you're going to say, all of those things. So they're useful in all of those ways. A pause is very effective in any talk, but it'll always feel longer to you than it actually is. Now, a method that you can use to get used to using pauses is to take a slow breath before each sentence when you're reading the talk out loud in practice. And that will get you into a rhythm of thinking about the pace that you're presenting as well, because too often I see people who race through a presentation because they're nervous, because they want it over and done with, because they've got so much information that they need to pass on. Whatever the reason is, they race through a presentation, and we're going to look at the pace that you need to present at in a later session, but essentially it is slower than normal conversation. So what are the uses of a pause, really? A pause clears your head. It makes you enunciate your words. It helps you physically to get the words out by straightening your posture because you're taking a breath in. And it'll give you an idea of how you can use the time that's been allocated to you effectively without filling it completely with words. Pauses, when we think about them, have been with us in every presentation right back to our school days. You know, if you think about when you were at school, and for me that's a long time ago, you'll think about a time where you were sitting in the classroom and you weren't really listening, and then all of a sudden the teacher's voice stopped, and then you were really worried about whether you were going to be asked the question that you knew was coming. So they're an impact as well as a controlling feature in your presentation. So we will continue to talk about pauses as we go through these sessions. My recommendations for you when you're preparing your presentation is to write your presentation the way you talk. Don't read everything from PowerPoint and Keynote, so don't just use a PowerPoint presentation as the basis for how you're going to do your presentation and think you don't have to write out something that you're going to actually say. Give yourself hints in your notes, as I've said all the way through, where you pause, where you smile, where you tell a particular story. Use a large font if you're going to take your notes with you, and a single side of each page, and number the pages. You don't have to have them attached to one another, but certainly number them so that it's clear where you are, where you've got your roadmap when you're doing your presentation. Make the order of your presentation visible like a roadmap, and that'd be something that you would explain at the start of the presentation. You're going telling them what you're going to tell them before you tell them, and then at the end you're going to tell them what you told them. Keep the order logical. Don't be preachy about methods or techniques. It's the time when people will switch off because they feel like you're condescending and you're telling them things that they feel they should already know or they might already know. Avoid cliches in your presentation. Assign responsibility. Don't use they say, and give credit as well. So practice a bit of accurate speaking, and in a later session I'll probably talk a little bit more about accurate speaking. Don't do a brain dump. Don't just tell them everything you know or everything you think of or everything that comes to mind when you're on this particular topic, and don't ramble. Have a roadmap for yourself as well as for your audience. Be concrete, make analogies, give examples, tell a story to illustrate a point. Reiterate your major points. It doesn't matter how many times you repeat something that you've said previously. In any sort of presentation, you will find that the impact areas, the major points, will be reiterated over and over again. Don't fade away at the end. Your last sentence should be one of the strongest that you've made. And in fact, I always think it should be the strongest thing that you've said. First sentence or the first impression that you make and the last thing that you say, whether it's a call to action or it's a visionary statement or it's a summary of what you said, it's got to be strong and you've got to say it in a strong voice. But for now, that's all about writing and preparing your presentation. I'll see you in the next session.